Something is happening behind the scenes of your life right now, and you've been misreading it. The people who suddenly entered your world and changed everything in just a few weeks were not random. They were not coincidence. And they were not meant to stay forever. In spiritual traditions and twin flame narratives, there is a belief that certain souls arrive like lightning, not to complete your story but to rewrite it. They don't ask for permission. They don't wait for timing. They simply appear, and everything you thought was stable begins to shift. And here's what most people never realize. When your life feels like it's collapsing after meeting someone, it's often not destruction, it's rearrangement. But why does it happen so fast? Why do some people enter your world and change your emotions, your decisions, even your identity in just weeks? Because in this framework, they are not here to fit into your life. They are here to unlock the version of you that your old life couldn't hold anymore. And once that unlocking begins, nothing can stay the same. Have you ever met someone who changed your life before you even understood their name? Not someone you spent years with. Not someone who slowly earned your trust over decades. But someone who walked into your world, and within days, or perhaps only a few weeks, everything inside you began to shift. Your routines changed. Your priorities changed. Your dreams changed. Even the way you looked at yourself began to transform. If you've experienced something like this, you may have spent months trying to explain it logically. Maybe you told yourself you were simply infatuated. Maybe you believed loneliness had made you vulnerable. Perhaps you convinced yourself it was only perfect timing, coincidence, or chemistry. Yet deep inside, none of those explanations ever felt complete. Because some encounters refuse to fit inside ordinary explanations. Some people arrive carrying an invisible force that seems to awaken parts of you that had been asleep your entire life. And whether you believe in twin flames, soul contracts, divine timing, or simply the mysterious intelligence of human connection, there is one undeniable truth. Some people change your life in weeks because they were never meant to enter your story as ordinary people. They entered as catalysts. And catalysts never ask for permission before they transform everything. What makes this even stranger is that the change often begins before anything significant actually happens between you. Sometimes it's just a conversation. Sometimes it's prolonged eye contact. Sometimes it's one unexpected message. Or one chance meeting that lasts less than an hour. Yet afterward, nothing feels quite the same. You wake up thinking about them. You begin questioning choices you haven't questioned in years. Dreams become unusually vivid. Old memories suddenly resurface without warning. It's almost as if meeting this person activated hidden rooms inside your own mind. Why? Because profound transformation rarely begins with external events. It begins when another person unknowingly becomes a mirror. Not a mirror that reflects your appearance. A mirror that reflects your soul. And most people are terrified of mirrors like that. Because ordinary relationships allow us to keep pretending. We pretend we're happy. We pretend we've healed. We pretend we've forgiven. We pretend we've moved on. But certain people don't allow those masks to survive. Without saying much. Without trying. Without even realizing it. They expose everything we've spent years hiding from ourselves. That's why these encounters often feel both beautiful and deeply uncomfortable. One moment you feel more alive than you've ever felt. The next, you're overwhelmed by emotions you thought had disappeared years ago. Old heartbreak, childhood wounds, fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough. They all rise to the surface at once. At first, this feels like the connection is ruining your peace. But perhaps your peace wasn't peace at all. Perhaps it was simply emotional numbness disguised as stability. There's an important difference. Real peace doesn't require suppressing your feelings. False peace depends on avoiding them. And sometimes, one extraordinary person enters your life specifically to make avoidance impossible. Think about a forest after decades without fire. Everything appears calm, quiet, beautiful. But underneath the surface, dead branches continue piling higher. Dry leaves collect year after year. The forest looks healthy until one tiny spark reveals how much lifeless material has accumulated. The fire appears destructive. Yet every ecologist knows something remarkable. Certain forests require fire before they can grow again. Some seeds cannot even open without extreme heat. Without the fire, those seeds remain trapped forever. Your emotional life often works exactly the same way. The arrival of one significant person becomes the spark. Not because they are trying to hurt you, not because they are intentionally creating chaos, but because your soul has accumulated years of unprocessed experiences that can no longer remain buried. This is why the weeks after meeting someone significant often feel incredibly confusing. You may suddenly lose interest in your career, or discover that friendships you've maintained for years no longer feel authentic. Maybe habits you've relied upon suddenly become unbearable. Maybe you've outgrown places that once felt like home. Nothing externally has changed very much. Yet internally, everything has. This can feel frightening because humans naturally seek stability. We want certainty. We want predictable routines. We want clear answers. But transformation has never promised comfort. It only promises growth. Imagine a caterpillar halfway through becoming a butterfly. If it could speak, it would probably believe its entire world was ending. Its old body dissolves. Its previous identity literally disappears. There comes a point where it is no longer a caterpillar. Yet it is not a butterfly either. It exists in an uncomfortable in-between state. And perhaps that's exactly where you are now. Not who you used to be. Not yet who you're becoming. Many spiritual teachers describe this as an awakening. Psychologists might call it identity reconstruction. Neuroscientists might explain it through changes in emotional processing and neural pathways. Different languages, different perspectives, yet all pointing toward one reality. Human beings sometimes experience rapid transformation after encountering people who profoundly challenge their existing worldview. Now, within the twin flame perspective, this process carries an even deeper symbolic meaning. It suggests that certain souls appear precisely when your old identity can no longer support your future purpose. Notice something important. This doesn't necessarily mean every intense connection is a twin flame. Not every powerful relationship is destined to last forever. Not every unforgettable person is meant to become your lifelong partner. Intensity alone proves nothing. What matters is what awakens inside you. Did you become more honest? More courageous? More aware? More compassionate? Did you finally confront fears you've spent years avoiding? Did you begin asking questions about your life that you'd never dared ask before? If so, then regardless of the label attached to the relationship, the transformation itself is real. And perhaps that's the greater miracle. Because maybe the universe isn't primarily concerned with giving you the perfect person. Maybe it's far more interested in helping you become the person capable of living your deepest purpose. Sometimes that process begins with love. Sometimes it begins with loss. Sometimes it begins with someone staying. Sometimes it begins with someone leaving far too soon. But in every case, the encounter becomes a doorway. The strange thing about doorways is that once you've walked through them, you can never truly return to who you were before. You may try. You may attempt to rebuild your old routines. You may convince yourself the encounter meant nothing. You may bury the memories beneath work, distractions, or new relationships. Yet somewhere inside, you already know. Something irreversible happened. Because the greatest transformations are rarely loud. They don't always announce themselves with dramatic signs. Often they begin in complete silence. One conversation. One glance. One unexpected meeting. One person. One ordinary day that quietly divides your entire life into two chapters. The person you were before you met them, and the person you became afterward. So before you dismiss that unforgettable encounter as coincidence, ask yourself one question. What if they didn't arrive to become the center of your life? What if they arrived to awaken the center of you? Because the most life-changing people are not always the ones who stay forever. Sometimes they are simply the ones who remind you that your soul has been waiting to wake up all along. And if that awakening has already begun, then this is only the beginning of your journey. In the next chapter, we'll uncover why so many of these life-changing encounters seem to happen only after seasons of betrayal, loneliness, and emotional exhaustion, and why that timing may be far more meaningful than it first appears. Before they appeared, your heart had already been carrying a weight that no one else could see. People often believe that life-changing connections happen because everything finally goes right. But if you've lived through an experience that feels like a twin flame awakening, you probably know the opposite is often true. The connection didn't arrive at the happiest chapter of your life. It arrived after disappointment, after betrayal, after years of trying to become someone everyone else wanted you to be. It came when you were emotionally exhausted. And perhaps that's the first mystery worth exploring. Why do the most transformative people so often appear after our darkest seasons? Maybe you've asked yourself that question. Why now? Why after all the heartbreak? Why after losing people I trusted? Why after feeling invisible for so many years? Perhaps you've even wondered if the universe was punishing you. If somehow you had done something wrong. If all the suffering meant you had missed your chance at happiness. But what if those painful seasons were never evidence that you had been abandoned? What if they were evidence that something inside you was quietly preparing to change? Think back to who you were before this person entered your life. Were you truly living? Or were you simply surviving? There's a difference. Survival is waking up every morning because you have responsibilities. Living is waking up because something inside you feels genuinely alive. Many people spend years surviving without realizing they've stopped living. They go to work. They pay bills. They smile in photographs. They answer messages. They celebrate birthdays. Everything appears normal. Yet underneath, they've disconnected from themselves. Perhaps you know exactly what that feels like. You became the reliable one. The strong one. The one everyone leaned on. You solved everyone else's problems while silently carrying your own. You smiled because explaining your pain became too exhausting. Eventually, people stopped asking how you were. Or perhaps they never really asked in the first place. Instead, they assumed you'd always be okay. Strong people often receive the least emotional support because everyone mistakes strength for the absence of pain. But strength isn't the absence of suffering. Sometimes it's simply becoming skilled at hiding it. Maybe your family misunderstood you. Not because they were evil. Not because they didn't care. But because they couldn't understand experiences they had never lived themselves. You tried explaining why you felt different. Why ordinary goals no longer inspired you. Why certain environments drained your energy. Why you needed solitude. Why you couldn't simply move on. Yet every explanation seemed to create more distance. Eventually, you stopped trying. You learned that silence required less energy than constantly defending your inner world. Then there were the betrayals. Not always dramatic betrayals. Sometimes they arrived quietly. A friend who disappeared when you needed them most. A relationship where you gave endlessly but received very little in return. A promise that slowly dissolved into excuses. People who loved the version of you that sacrificed everything, but became uncomfortable once you started valuing yourself. These experiences leave invisible scars. The kind that don't appear in photographs. The kind no doctor can diagnose. The kind that quietly whisper dangerous beliefs. Don't trust too easily. Don't expect too much. Don't be vulnerable again. Don't hope. Little by little, your heart began building walls. Not because you wanted to become cold, but because disappointment had become too familiar. Every heartbreak added another brick. Every rejection strengthened the foundation. Every misunderstanding made the walls higher. Eventually you became so good at protecting yourself that even genuine love would have struggled to reach you. Here's the paradox. The walls that protect us from pain also protect us from connection. The same door that keeps danger outside often keeps healing outside too. Imagine living inside a beautiful castle. Its walls are thick. Its gates are secure. No enemy can enter. But eventually, neither can anyone who genuinely loves you. Safety slowly transforms into loneliness. Many people live emotionally this way without realizing it. They call it independence. They call it maturity. They call it having high standards. Sometimes it is. But sometimes, it's fear wearing a sophisticated disguise. Deep down, you may have still wanted someone to truly know you. Not the version you presented to the world. The real version. The one who questioned everything. The one who cried in private. The one who secretly wondered why you always felt different from everyone around you. The one who carried dreams you rarely spoke aloud. Because there is a unique loneliness that comes from feeling fundamentally misunderstood. You can be surrounded by family, supported by coworkers, loved by friends, yet still carry the quiet feeling that nobody truly sees you. Perhaps you've experienced entering a crowded room and somehow feeling completely alone. Not because people ignored you, because no one recognized the person hiding beneath your personality. You became an expert at adaptation. Around one group, you acted cheerful. Around another, you became logical. With family, you stayed quiet. At work, you remained professional. Eventually, you wore so many different masks that you forgot which one was actually yours. Carl Jung once suggested that every person develops a social mask, a persona, to function within society. The mask isn't inherently wrong. We all need one. The danger begins when we mistake the mask for our true identity. And perhaps that's exactly where you found yourself. Not living as your authentic self. Living as the version that created the fewest conflicts. The version that disappointed the fewest people. The version that seemed acceptable. Yet something inside continued whispering, "This isn't all I am." Then life became even more confusing. Because just when you thought you had accepted this ordinary existence, someone appeared. They looked at you differently. They listened differently. Sometimes they said very little. Yet somehow, you felt seen. Not admired. Seen. There's an enormous difference. Admiration focuses on what you've accomplished. Being seen means someone recognizes parts of you that even you struggle to explain. And that experience can feel overwhelming. Because after years of emotional invisibility, recognition feels almost unbelievable. Some people describe it as coming home. Others describe it as remembering something they never knew they had forgotten. Within twin flame teachings, this moment is often described as soul recognition. Whether taken literally or symbolically, the emotional experience can be profound. It's as though someone quietly says to your spirit, "I know you," without needing proof, without needing years of explanation, without needing you to perform. For someone who has spent years feeling misunderstood, that recognition can shake the foundations of reality. But here's the deeper truth. This recognition wasn't only about meeting them. It was also about meeting yourself. Because before another person can reveal your hidden light, that light must already exist within you. They didn't create your worth. They reflected it. They didn't invent your strength. They reminded you of it. They didn't place purpose inside your soul. They awakened the purpose that had been sleeping beneath years of disappointment. This is why your life began changing so quickly. Not because they magically transformed you. Because they interrupted the story you had been telling yourself. The story that said, "I'm too broken. I'm too much. I'm not enough. No one will ever understand me. This is all life will ever be." One genuine encounter has the power to challenge years of false beliefs. Think about that. A belief repeated for 20 years can begin collapsing after one authentic moment. Not because the moment was more powerful than your past, but because truth has always been stronger than illusion. Illusion simply survives through repetition. The moment someone reflects your authentic self, the illusion begins losing its grip. Of course, this doesn't immediately feel comfortable. Quite the opposite. Your old identity starts resisting. Your fears grow louder. Your doubts multiply. You question everything. Was the connection real? Am I imagining this? Why can't I stop thinking about them? Why does everything feel different now? These questions are natural, because every awakening begins with uncertainty. You cannot step into a new life while thinking exactly like the person you used to be. Confusion is often the bridge between old consciousness and new awareness. And perhaps that's why your most painful experiences were never meaningless. They softened the ground. They cracked the shell around your heart. They exhausted the false identities you had outgrown. Not because suffering itself is sacred, but because once it has been lived through, it can leave us more willing to question who we have become. By the time this extraordinary person entered your life, you were already standing at the edge of transformation. You simply didn't know it yet. They didn't start your awakening. They accelerated it. They didn't create the doorway. They helped you notice that it had been standing in front of you all along. And in the next chapter, we'll explore why these powerful connections often feel almost impossibly familiar from the very beginning, and why a stranger can sometimes awaken emotions that no one you've known for years ever could. There is a moment that almost everyone who experiences a life-changing connection eventually faces. It is the moment when nothing makes sense anymore. The excitement of the first encounter begins to mix with uncertainty. The certainty you once felt is replaced by questions. Why has communication changed? Why do I suddenly feel anxious? Why is my entire life becoming unstable? If this connection was meant for me, why does it feel like everything is falling apart? These questions have echoed through countless spiritual communities for years. They are whispered in journal pages written at 2 o'clock in the morning. They are carried into meditation rooms. They are asked through tears after another sleepless night. And perhaps you've asked them too. Because one of the greatest paradoxes surrounding deeply transformative relationships is this. The closer you move toward becoming your authentic self, the more your old life begins to resist your transformation. At first glance, this seems completely unfair. After everything you've endured, after years of loneliness, after surviving disappointment after disappointment, shouldn't life finally become easier? Shouldn't the universe reward your perseverance with immediate peace? Yet real transformation rarely unfolds that way. Imagine renovating an old house. From the outside, it may appear beautiful. The walls are standing. The roof still covers the rooms. Visitors compliment its appearance. But an experienced architect notices something different. The foundation has begun to crack. Hidden water damage weakens the support beams. Electrical systems are dangerously outdated. If you truly want the house to last another 50 years, cosmetic changes aren't enough. The walls must be opened. The damaged wood removed. The unstable foundation reinforced. For weeks, or perhaps months, the house actually looks worse than before. Dust fills every room. Furniture disappears. Floors are torn apart. Anyone walking inside might believe the house is being destroyed. But destruction was never the goal. Restoration was. Your emotional life often follows the same pattern. Before this significant person entered your world, you may have believed everything was relatively stable. You had routines, responsibilities, predictable relationships, predictable emotions. Even your pain had become predictable. You knew exactly which memories to avoid, which conversations to escape, which dreams to ignore. You had learned how to function. But functioning is not the same as flourishing. Then someone arrived who unknowingly challenged the entire architecture of your inner world. Not because they demanded change. Sometimes they simply existed. Sometimes their presence alone became enough to expose what no longer fit your future. Within the twin flame perspective, people often describe this stage as the collapse before alignment. Whether one interprets this literally or symbolically, the experience itself feels remarkably similar. Old friendships begin fading. Jobs that once seemed secure suddenly feel meaningless. Family dynamics become more difficult. You lose interest in conversations that once entertained you. Even your daily habits begin changing without conscious effort. You start asking questions you never dared ask before. Who am I becoming? Why do I no longer recognize my own life? What happened to the person I used to be? The answer is both simple and uncomfortable. The person you used to be was built for survival. The person you're becoming is being built for authenticity. And those two identities cannot occupy the same space forever. Think about how a snake sheds its skin. From a distance, shedding appears violent. The old skin splits. The snake rubs itself against rough surfaces. Progress seems painfully slow. For a time, it appears trapped between two identities. Yet no healthy snake mourns the skin it has outgrown. It leaves it behind because remaining inside it would eventually become impossible. Human transformation is no different. Yet unlike the snake, we often try to crawl back into identities we've already outgrown. We return to relationships that no longer nourish us. We replay conversations that ended years ago. We cling to versions of ourselves that once kept us safe, but now keep us small. We mistake familiarity for destiny. But familiarity is not always guidance. Sometimes it is simply habit. This is why life-changing encounters feel so disruptive. They interrupt habit. Not because habit is inherently bad. Because unconscious habit prevents conscious growth. You may have noticed this already. Perhaps after meeting this person, your tolerance for dishonesty became much lower. Maybe you suddenly recognized unhealthy dynamics you'd accepted for years. Conversations that once seemed normal began feeling exhausting. People who constantly criticized you no longer felt comfortable to be around. You weren't becoming difficult. You were becoming awake. An awakening always changes your standards. Consider the story of a woman named Elena. For nearly 15 years, she worked at the same company. Everyone admired her reliability. She arrived early, stayed late, never complained. She told herself she was grateful. Yet every Sunday evening, a quiet sadness settled over her. She ignored it. She believed adulthood simply felt this way. Then she met someone during a weekend volunteer project. They weren't romantically involved. In fact, they barely knew each other. But during one ordinary conversation, he asked a question no one had ever asked her. What would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? She laughed at first. Then she realized she had no answer. That single question followed her home. For weeks she couldn't stop thinking about it. Eventually she admitted something she had hidden even from herself. She had spent years living according to fear instead of purpose. Within 6 months, she began studying something entirely different. Within a year, she left the career she thought she would keep forever. Years later, she often said that one conversation had divided her life into 2 completely different chapters. Was the stranger her twin flame? Perhaps. Perhaps not. The label matters less than the transformation. Because catalysts appear in many forms. Sometimes they stay forever. Sometimes they disappear almost immediately. But their influence continues long after their physical presence ends. Perhaps this explains why certain people remain unforgettable. Not because they gave us everything we wanted, but because they awakened everything we had forgotten about ourselves. Here's something rarely discussed. Many people assume that if a connection is spiritually significant, it should immediately remove fear. Often it does the opposite. It exposes fear. Imagine shining a flashlight into a dark basement. The flashlight doesn't create the dust. It simply reveals what was already there. Likewise, transformative relationships don't create your deepest insecurities. They illuminate them. Fear of abandonment. Fear of intimacy. Fear of rejection. Fear of success. Fear of becoming visible. Fear of finally accepting your own worth. These fears may seem unrelated to love, yet they quietly influence every decision you make. Until they become conscious, they remain in control. This is why the period following an awakening often feels emotionally overwhelming. You aren't becoming weaker. You're becoming more honest. And honesty is exhausting before it becomes liberating. Carl Rogers, one of the founders of humanistic psychology, once observed that the curious paradox is that when we accept ourselves as we are, then we can change. Notice the order. Acceptance first. Transformation second. Not the other way around. Many people spend years believing they must become worthy before life improves. But perhaps worthiness was never the destination. Perhaps it was the forgotten starting point. The person who entered your life may have unknowingly reflected that truth back to you. Not by giving you validation, but by awakening your capacity to recognize your own value. And this is where many journeys become confusing. Because once you begin valuing yourself, certain relationships naturally begin falling away. Some people celebrate your growth. Others quietly resent it. The version of you that tolerated disrespect made certain relationships very comfortable. The version of you that establishes healthy boundaries changes everything. Not everyone welcomes that change. Some will accuse you of becoming selfish. Others will say you've changed. They're right. You have. Growth always changes people. The real question is whether you're becoming more authentic or merely more acceptable. These are not always the same thing. Within many spiritual traditions, there is an old idea that before new blessings can enter your life, space must first be created for them. Whether you interpret this spiritually or psychologically, the principle remains surprisingly practical. A closet filled with old clothes has no room for new ones. A calendar filled with obligations has no room for meaningful opportunities. A heart filled entirely with old wounds struggles to receive new experiences without filtering them through old pain. Space matters. And sometimes life creates that space in ways we initially misunderstand. The friendship ends. The job changes. The routine disappears. The certainty dissolves. From within the experience, it feels like loss. Looking back years later, many people realize it was preparation. Not punishment. Preparation. Perhaps that is the greatest misunderstanding surrounding profound life changes. We assume that if something leaves, we have failed. But what if departure is not always evidence of failure? What if sometimes it is evidence of completion? A teacher eventually leaves because the lesson has been learned. A bridge is crossed because it was never meant to become your home. A season changes because remaining in spring forever would prevent the harvest of autumn. Maybe the people who changed your life in just a few weeks were never sent to stay exactly as they arrived. Maybe they were sent to awaken a version of you that had been waiting beneath years of fear, disappointment, and self-doubt. Because the greatest gift some souls ever offer us is not their permanent presence. It is their ability to remind us that our real journey was never about finding someone else to complete us. It was about becoming the person we were always meant to be. And once that awakening begins, even if the road ahead feels uncertain, one truth quietly remains. Everything that is leaving your life is making room for everything your soul has been preparing to receive. There comes a moment in every profound transformation when the question is no longer about the other person. It becomes about you. For weeks, perhaps months, maybe even years. Your attention has revolved around the connection. Why did they appear? Why did they leave? Will they come back? What were they trying to teach me? Was this destiny? Was this love? Was this a twin flame? These questions are natural. When someone enters your life with overwhelming intensity, your mind instinctively tries to solve the mystery. It searches for signs. It revisits old conversations. It analyzes every message, every silence, every coincidence. You begin connecting invisible dots. Maybe that repeated number on the clock meant something. Maybe that unexpected dream carried a hidden message. Maybe the song that suddenly started playing wasn't random. Perhaps it all feels like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. But eventually, every genuine awakening reaches a turning point. A quiet realization begins to emerge. The greatest mystery was never the other person. The greatest mystery has always been the person you are becoming. This is the point where spiritual growth shifts from seeking external confirmation to discovering inner certainty. Many people never reach this stage. They remain trapped in endless waiting. Waiting for another text. Waiting for another meeting. Waiting for another sign. Waiting for the perfect explanation. Waiting for closure. Waiting for life to begin again. Yet waiting can become its own prison. Not because patience is wrong. Patience is a beautiful quality. But there is a profound difference between patient trust and emotional paralysis. Patient trust says, I will continue living while life unfolds. Emotional paralysis says, my life cannot truly begin until this one person returns. Those are two entirely different ways of moving through the world. One creates freedom. The other creates dependence. Within many twin flame discussions, people often become so focused on reunion that they unintentionally forget the deeper purpose of the journey. The goal was never simply to find someone. The goal was to remember yourself. Imagine standing before a mirror covered with years of dust. You don't replace the mirror. You gently remove what has been hiding its reflection. Likewise, your soul has never needed replacement. It has only needed remembrance. The remarkable thing about remembrance is that it cannot be given to you by another person forever. Someone may awaken it. Someone may inspire it. Someone may remind you of it. But eventually, you must choose to live from it. That choice changes everything. Perhaps you've noticed something curious. The more you chase certainty outside yourself, the more uncertain everything feels. The more desperately you seek reassurance, the more anxious your heart becomes. But the moment you begin asking a different question, everything starts changing. Instead of asking, will they choose me? You begin asking, am I choosing myself? Instead of wondering, when will they awaken? You quietly ask, how can I continue awakening today? Instead of hoping they become emotionally available, you become emotionally available to yourself. At first, this sounds almost too simple. But simplicity is often where profound truths hide. Think about a tree growing in the middle of a forest. It doesn't wake each morning wondering whether the neighboring trees approve of its growth. It doesn't compare the length of its branches. It doesn't delay blooming until another tree blooms first. It simply responds to sunlight, to rain, to the changing seasons. Its growth comes from alignment with its own nature. Human beings often forget this. We become so focused on external timing that we lose connection with our own inner rhythm. We compare our healing to someone else's. Our relationships, our careers, our spiritual progress. We wonder why another person's life appears to be moving faster than ours. Yet nature has never operated through comparison. A flower blooming in spring does not judge the oak tree that requires decades to mature. The river does not criticize the mountain for remaining still. Everything unfolds according to its own design. Perhaps your life is asking the same of you. To stop measuring your journey against someone else's timeline. To trust that what feels delayed may actually be developing invisible roots. This idea appears repeatedly across both psychology and spiritual philosophy. Growth often happens beneath the surface long before it becomes visible. Think of bamboo. For years after it is planted, very little appears above the ground. Someone unfamiliar with its nature might assume nothing is happening. Yet beneath the soil, an extraordinary root system is spreading in every direction. Then almost suddenly, the bamboo begins growing at an astonishing speed. The visible growth seems miraculous. But it was never sudden. It was prepared by years of invisible development. Perhaps your life has been unfolding in exactly the same way. Those lonely nights. Those unanswered prayers. Those seasons when nothing seemed to change. What if they were never empty? What if they were quietly strengthening the roots of the person you were becoming? This perspective changes everything. Because now your suffering is no longer interpreted as wasted time. It becomes preparation. Not preparation for one specific relationship. Preparation for a different way of living. There is another misunderstanding that deserves attention. Many people believe healing means never feeling pain again. But healing has never promised the absence of pain. Healing changes your relationship with pain. Before awakening, disappointment convinces you that you are broken. After awakening, disappointment becomes information. Before awakening, rejection defines your identity. After awakening, rejection redirects your path. Before awakening, uncertainty feels like punishment. After awakening, uncertainty becomes possibility. Notice what changes. The events themselves may remain difficult. What transforms is your interpretation. And interpretation shapes experience. Two people can walk through the same storm. One sees only destruction. The other notices that the rain is nourishing the earth. The storm is identical. The meaning is different. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived unimaginable hardship during the Second World War, wrote that while many freedoms can be taken away, one freedom always remains: the freedom to choose one's attitude toward a given situation. His words continue to resonate because they remind us of something powerful. Life does not always allow us to choose what happens, but it continually invites us to choose who we become because of what happens. Perhaps that is the real initiation hidden within transformative relationships. Not whether another person stays, but whether you allow the experience to make your heart wiser instead of harder. There is a subtle difference. A hardened heart closes itself to avoid future pain. A wise heart remains open while developing discernment. One avoids love. The other understands love more deeply. One builds walls. The other builds boundaries. Walls say, no one may enter. Boundaries say, only what is healthy may remain. This distinction may be one of the greatest gifts your journey has offered you. You no longer need to abandon yourself to keep someone else comfortable. You no longer need to shrink your dreams to maintain acceptance. You no longer need to apologize for becoming who you truly are. Some people will leave because of your growth. Others will be inspired by it. Neither response determines your worth. Your worth was never meant to be negotiated. Within twin flame teachings, reunion is often described as the ultimate destination. Yet perhaps reunion begins much earlier than many people imagine. Perhaps the first reunion is not between two people. Perhaps it is between you. And the parts of yourself you abandoned in order to survive. The child who dreamed without fear. The young adult who believed love could be genuine. The creative soul who stopped expressing themselves after repeated criticism. The compassionate heart that became cautious after betrayal. What if the real reunion is the gathering of all these forgotten pieces into one whole human being? Carl Jung called this process individuation, the gradual integration of every aspect of ourselves into a more complete identity. Spiritual traditions describe something remarkably similar. Different words. The same invitation. Become whole. Not perfect. Whole. Wholeness does not erase your scars. It gives them meaning. Wholeness does not deny your grief. It allows grief to become wisdom instead of bitterness. Wholeness does not guarantee an easy future. It prepares you to meet the future with a different heart. And perhaps this is why some people change your life in only a few weeks. Not because they somehow possess magical power over your destiny. Not because your happiness depends entirely upon them. But because their presence interrupts the life you were unconsciously repeating. They become the unexpected invitation to step beyond fear, beyond old identities, and beyond the stories that convinced you your best days were already behind you. Whether they remain beside you for decades or only for a brief season, their greatest gift may never have been the relationship itself. Their greatest gift was awakening the courage to become someone you had almost forgotten existed. So if you find yourself wondering whether that extraordinary encounter truly meant something, perhaps the better question is this: have you become more honest? More compassionate? More courageous? More willing to protect your peace? More committed to living according to your deepest values instead of your deepest fears? If the answer is yes, then the connection has already fulfilled one of its most beautiful purposes. Because the people who change your life in weeks are not always sent to give you all the answers. Sometimes they are sent to awaken the questions that lead you back to yourself. And when you finally begin choosing yourself, not from pride, but from genuine self-respect, you discover something quietly extraordinary. You stop chasing what is meant to convince you of your worth. You begin attracting what resonates with the person you have become. Whether you view that future through the lens of twin flame teachings, spiritual growth, or the natural evolution of the human heart, the invitation remains the same. Release what no longer defines you. Honor what has transformed you. Trust what is still unfolding. And remember this: the people who changed your life in just a few weeks may have entered your story for only a chapter. But the person they awakened within you, that is the companion who will walk beside you for the rest of your life. If this message resonated with your journey, take a quiet moment today and ask yourself one simple question. Who am I becoming because of everything I have lived through? Then, if you feel ready to step into that next version of yourself, leave a comment below. Y accept mi transformación. Not because those words create your destiny, but because sometimes speaking your intention aloud is the first step toward finally living it. Perhaps the hardest truth to accept about life-changing people is this: not everyone who transforms your life is meant to remain in it forever. At first, this feels deeply unfair. After all, if someone has awakened parts of your soul that no one else ever reached, if they helped you see yourself in an entirely new way, if they changed the direction of your life in just a few weeks, wouldn't it make sense that they would stay? Wouldn't that be the perfect ending? Yet life rarely unfolds according to our idea of perfection. Instead, it often follows a quieter wisdom, one that only becomes visible when we look back instead of forward. Think about your own life for a moment. Can you remember a teacher whose words stayed with you long after the class ended? A stranger who gave you unexpected advice that changed your decisions for years? A friend you only knew for a short season, yet somehow they permanently altered the way you viewed the world. Perhaps you don't even remember every conversation you had with them, but you remember how you felt after meeting them. You remember the person you became. Sometimes influence is measured not by duration, but by depth. A candle that burns for 1 hour can light another candle that continues burning long after the first flame disappears. The first flame doesn't lose its purpose because it burns for only a short time. Its purpose was never to last forever. Its purpose was to ignite another light. Perhaps some relationships exist for the same reason. This idea can be difficult to embrace because the human heart naturally connects meaning with permanence. We assume that what matters most should last the longest. Yet when you look closely at nature, you discover a different pattern. Spring flowers bloom for only a brief season. Morning dew disappears within hours. A rainbow may last only minutes. A sunset slowly fades into darkness every evening. None of these experiences become less beautiful because they are temporary. In many ways, their impermanence is part of what makes them unforgettable. Perhaps certain people enter our lives in the same way. Not to remain forever, but to leave behind something eternal within us. Within twin flame teachings, there is often great emphasis placed on reunion. Countless people spend years waiting for the day they will finally reconnect with the person who awakened them. Some eventually do. Others never experience the reunion they imagined. This reality raises an uncomfortable question. What happens if reunion never arrives? Does that mean the journey failed? Does it mean the connection was false? Or does it invite us to discover a deeper understanding of why the connection existed in the first place? Perhaps the greatest mistake we can make is believing that the value of a relationship depends entirely on its ending. Imagine reading a beautiful book. Would you call the entire story meaningless simply because the final chapter surprised you? Would you erase every lesson because the ending differed from your expectations? Of course not. The meaning of the story lives in every page. Relationships often deserve the same understanding. Their purpose cannot always be measured by whether they continue indefinitely. Sometimes their purpose is fulfilled the moment they awaken something essential within another human being. This perspective changes how we understand both love and loss. Instead of asking, "Why didn't they stay?" we begin asking, "What part of me came alive because they existed?" That question opens an entirely different door. Perhaps you became more courageous. Perhaps you finally pursued the career you had always postponed. Perhaps you forgave someone you had silently blamed for years. Perhaps you began therapy. Perhaps you rediscovered your creativity. Perhaps you learned how to establish healthy boundaries for the first time in your life. These changes did not happen because another person magically fixed you. They happened because the connection interrupted the unconscious patterns that had quietly shaped your life. There is an old story about a traveler climbing a mountain. Halfway up, he meets an elderly guide. The guide walks beside him for only a short distance before pointing toward a hidden path the traveler had completely overlooked. Without another word, the guide turns back down the mountain. At first, the traveler feels abandoned. Why wouldn't the guide continue helping? Years later, after reaching the summit, he finally understands. If the guide had climbed the mountain for him, he would never have discovered his own strength. Sometimes wisdom does not stay beside us. It simply points us toward the path we must walk ourselves. Perhaps some people enter our lives as guides rather than destinations. Not because they love us less, but because our deepest growth requires personal experience rather than permanent dependence. Modern psychology offers an interesting parallel. Researchers often describe emotionally significant relationships as corrective emotional experiences. These encounters challenge long-held beliefs about ourselves and about the world. Someone treats us with unexpected kindness after years of criticism. Someone believes in us after decades of self-doubt. Someone listens without judgment after a lifetime of misunderstanding. These moments begin rewriting emotional patterns that once seemed permanent. Notice something important. The healing comes not only from the other person's actions. It comes from our willingness to experience a new possibility. That possibility continues existing even after the relationship changes. Within the symbolic language of the twin flame journey, this is often described as carrying the awakening forward. The connection plants the seed. Your daily choices determine how that seed grows. This is where many people unknowingly give away their power. They continue waiting for another person to complete a process that has already begun within themselves. They postpone joy. They postpone purpose. They postpone living. All because they believe their story cannot continue without someone else's return. But life has always moved through seasons. No season remains forever. Winter does not apologize for ending. Summer does not refuse to leave. Every transition prepares the next chapter. What if relationships are no different? What if every meaningful encounter carries its own season? Some seasons teach trust. Others teach patience. Some teach surrender. Others teach courage. None are unnecessary. Even the painful ones. Especially the painful ones. This does not mean we should romanticize suffering. Pain by itself is not wisdom. Loss by itself is not transformation. Growth happens when we consciously engage with those experiences instead of allowing them to define us. A broken bone heals stronger only when it is properly cared for. If ignored, it may heal incorrectly. The same principle applies emotionally. Our wounds become wisdom only when we are willing to understand them. Perhaps that is why some people change your life in only a matter of weeks. Not because those weeks contain more time, but because they contain more awareness. Awareness changes everything. One honest conversation can dismantle years of self-deception. One act of forgiveness can release decades of resentment. One moment of genuine self-acceptance can transform an entire future. Time alone does not create transformation. Presence does. When you are fully present, even a brief encounter can echo across the rest of your life. This may explain why some of the most unforgettable relationships feel strangely timeless. You look back and realize, we only knew each other for a month. Yet emotionally, it feels as though you lived an entire lifetime within those weeks. Not because time expanded, Because consciousness expanded. You began seeing life differently. You began seeing yourself differently. And once perception changes, reality changes with it. There is another quiet truth worth considering. Perhaps the people who transform us most deeply are not extraordinary because they possess something we lack. Perhaps they simply arrive at the exact moment we are finally ready to recognize what has always existed within us. Think about a sunrise. The sun does not suddenly create the landscape. The mountains were already there. The rivers already flowed. The forests already stood. The light simply revealed what darkness had hidden. Perhaps awakening works the same way. The connection did not create your compassion. It illuminated it. It did not create your resilience. It revealed it. It did not create your purpose. It uncovered what had patiently waited beneath years of fear, doubt, and emotional survival. This realization carries immense freedom. Because if another person did not create your light, then another person's absence cannot extinguish it. Read that again. If another person did not create your light, then another person's absence cannot extinguish it. They may have helped you notice the flame. They may have protected it during a difficult season. They may have inspired it to burn brighter. But the fire itself has always belonged to you. This understanding transforms longing into gratitude. Instead of clinging to what was, you begin honoring what became possible because it happened. Instead of asking life to return you to the past, you allow the past to strengthen the future. And perhaps this is the hidden meaning behind those people who seem to change everything in just a few weeks. They remind us that destiny is not always about possession. Sometimes it is about preparation. Not every soul arrives to stay. Some arrive to awaken. Some arrive to challenge. Some arrive to heal. Some arrive to reveal the parts of ourselves that we buried beneath years of fear. Whether they remain for a lifetime or only for a season, their true gift is never measured by how long they walked beside us. It is measured by how deeply they changed the direction of our own footsteps. So if you're still wondering why someone entered your life with such astonishing intensity, perhaps the answer is simpler than you imagined. They came because your soul was ready for change. They came because the version of you that had survived for so long could no longer contain the life that was waiting to emerge. They came because awakening rarely announces itself with certainty. It often arrives disguised as an unexpected meeting, an unforgettable conversation, a relationship that changes everything before you fully understand why. And maybe years from now, you will look back on this chapter of your life with a different heart. Not asking why it happened, not grieving only what was lost, but quietly smiling because you finally understand what was given. The greatest people you will ever meet are not always the ones who stay beside you forever. They are the ones who awaken a version of you that will remain long after they are gone. That awakened self becomes your true companion. It walks with you through every future relationship, every challenge, every opportunity, every dream you finally have the courage to pursue. So today, instead of asking whether someone else is still thinking about you, ask a different question. How am I honoring the person I became because our paths crossed? That single question can transform longing into purpose. And if this message has spoken to something deep within your heart, take a moment to affirm the journey you are now walking. Leave a comment below. I accept my transformation, and I trust the path unfolding before me. Not because those words will magically change your future overnight, but because every meaningful journey begins with one conscious decision. The decision to stop living as the person you once were, and to courageously embrace the person you are becoming. There is a moment in every transformative connection when the story begins to shift in a direction you did not expect. At first, everything feels meaningful. Every message feels like a sign. Every coincidence feels intentional. Every emotional high feels like confirmation that something extraordinary is unfolding. But then slowly something changes. Silence becomes more frequent. Distance becomes noticeable. The intensity that once felt electric begins to feel uncertain. And you start asking yourself questions you were not prepared to ask. Did I misunderstand this? Was it real at all? Why does something that felt so destined begin to feel so unstable? This is where most people begin to suffer, not because the connection itself has changed, but because the meaning they assign to it begins to collapse. Because deep inside, many people carry an unconscious belief. If someone is truly meant for me, they will complete me. They will stabilize me. They will heal everything I've ever struggled with. They will make the confusion disappear. They will make life feel whole. But life-changing connections rarely function in that way. And this is where one of the most uncomfortable truths emerges. They did not enter your life to complete you. They entered to reveal you. That difference changes everything. Because completion implies dependency. But revelation implies awakening. Completion suggests something is missing. Revelation suggests something has been hidden. And what has been hidden is not your worth, but your awareness of your own wholeness. Many people discover this truth only after the emotional intensity begins to fade. When the excitement settles. When expectations are no longer met. When reality no longer matches the fantasy the mind created. And in that quiet space, something unexpected happens. You begin to see yourself more clearly than ever before. Not through the lens of desire. Not through the lens of fear. But through the lens of truth. And truth can be uncomfortable. Because it removes the illusions we once relied on to feel safe. Within the twin flame narrative, this stage is often described as the mirror effect. But whether you interpret it spiritually or psychologically, the experience is remarkably consistent. The person who changed your life begins to reflect parts of you that you were not fully aware of. Not intentionally. Not consciously. But inevitably. For example, if you have spent years suppressing emotional needs, this connection may awaken intense emotional vulnerability. If you have spent years avoiding abandonment wounds, this connection may trigger deep attachment fears. If you have spent years prioritizing others over yourself, this connection may force you to confront your own neglected identity. It feels as if the relationship is creating the pain. But in reality, it is revealing pain that already existed beneath the surface. This is why these connections often feel both beautiful and destabilizing at the same time. They do not simply add something new to your life. They expose what was already there, but unacknowledged. Imagine a room that has been locked for years. Inside it are boxes filled with memories you never fully processed. You know the room exists, but you rarely enter it. Then suddenly someone opens the door. Light floods in. Dust becomes visible. Objects you forgot about are suddenly everywhere. At first, it feels overwhelming. You might even wish the door had never been opened. But the truth is simple. The room was always part of your house. You just stopped looking inside it. In the same way, transformative relationships do not create emotional complexity. They reveal emotional complexity that has been quietly waiting for attention. This is why people often say, "I was fine before I met them." But fine is often not the same as fully aware. Fine can mean functional. Fine can mean distracted. Fine can mean emotionally contained. Fine can mean surviving without engaging deeply with unresolved parts of yourself. And then someone arrives who disrupts that equilibrium. Not by harming you, but by making avoidance impossible. They trigger questions you had postponed. They awaken feelings you had minimized. They bring clarity where there was previously numbness. And because humans naturally resist discomfort, the mind tries to assign responsibility outward. It becomes easier to say, "They caused this confusion," than to acknowledge, "They revealed what I was not ready to see." But revelation is not destruction. It is exposure. And exposure is often the first step toward healing. Think of a wound that has been covered for too long. If it is suddenly uncovered, it may hurt more at first. But the pain is not new. It is simply no longer hidden. In the same way, emotional awakening can feel like emotional chaos. But chaos is often what healing feels like in its early stages. Another important misunderstanding arises here. Many people believe that if a connection is divine or destined, it should feel effortless. But effortless connection is not the same as transformative connection. Effortless connection often feels safe because it does not challenge your identity. Transformative connection feels intense because it challenges your identity at its core. One comforts who you already are. The other confronts who you are becoming. And becoming is rarely comfortable. Consider the process of physical training. When you strengthen your body, resistance is required. Muscles do not grow in comfort. They grow in strain, in micro-tears, in recovery, in adaptation. Without resistance, there is no transformation. The same principle applies emotionally. Without emotional resistance, there is no deep psychological growth. This is why certain relationships feel like they break you. Not because they are wrong, but because they activate unused emotional capacity within you. Capacity for awareness. Capacity for boundaries. Capacity for self-respect. Capacity for emotional truth. From a psychological perspective, this aligns with what Carl Jung described as the shadow. The shadow represents parts of ourselves that we do not fully identify with, often because they were suppressed, ignored, or rejected during development. When someone enters our life and activates the shadow, it can feel threatening. Because we are suddenly confronted with aspects of ourselves we did not consciously choose to see. But Jung also emphasized something essential. Integration of the shadow is necessary for wholeness. What we reject within ourselves does not disappear. It influences us unconsciously until it is acknowledged. This is why certain relationships feel like they force growth. They are not forcing anything externally. They are simply bringing unconscious material into conscious awareness. And awareness always demands response. You either integrate it, or you resist it, but you cannot unsee what has been revealed. This is the deeper hidden purpose of many life-changing connections. Not romantic perfection, not emotional completion, but psychological and spiritual integration. The gradual process of becoming more whole, more honest, more internally aligned. This also explains why some connections cannot continue in their original form. Because once awareness expands, old dynamics no longer fit. What once felt acceptable begins to feel misaligned. What once felt exciting begins to feel unstable. What once felt like destiny begins to feel like distortion if it requires you to abandon yourself. And here lies one of the most important turning points in the entire journey. When you stop asking, how do I keep this connection? And start asking, who do I become within this connection? That shift is everything, because it moves you from attachment-based thinking to self-awareness-based living. And from that place, decisions become clearer. Sometimes the connection continues in a healthier form. Sometimes it transforms into something different. Sometimes it fades entirely. But regardless of outcome, something irreversible has already happened. You are no longer the same person who entered it. And that is the true purpose. Not dependency. Not obsession. Not confusion. But evolution. So if you find yourself struggling to understand why someone entered your life so intensely, only to create so much inner change, perhaps the answer is not found in them at all. Perhaps the answer is found in what they activated within you. Because the hidden purpose was never to complete your story. It was to awaken the author of it. And once you realize that you are the one writing your next chapter, not waiting for someone else to define it, you begin to understand something profoundly liberating. Nothing that awakened your truth was ever meant to keep you asleep. And nothing that disrupts your illusion was ever meant to harm your becoming. It was simply life, in its quiet intelligence, guiding you back to yourself. There is a strange silence that follows emotional upheaval. Not the silence of peace. Not the silence of resolution. But the silence that arrives after everything you once relied on has shifted. It is the kind of silence that feels unfamiliar at first. Because for so long, your inner world was filled with questions. Why did they come into my life? Why did they leave? What was real and what was illusion? Did I imagine everything? Will I ever feel that connection again? But now, Even those questions begin to lose their urgency. Not because you have received all the answers, but because something inside you has changed its relationship with needing them. This is the beginning of the transformation phase, and it rarely announces itself loudly. There is no clear moment where you wake up and think, "Now I am healed." Instead, it appears quietly in your daily life. You notice it in small ways. One day, a memory of them appears, and it no longer destabilizes you. It passes through your mind like a cloud passing through the sky. Present, acknowledged, and then gone. No longer something that defines your emotional state. No longer something that pulls you backward. This is how transformation begins to reveal itself. Not through dramatic declarations, but through subtle internal freedom. Many people misunderstand this stage because they expect healing to feel like erasure. They believe that moving on means forgetting. But real transformation does not erase the past. It changes your relationship with it. The memory remains, but its emotional control weakens. It becomes a chapter in your story, not the entire book. You begin to realize something important. The pain did not disappear. You changed. And because you changed, the pain no longer occupies the same space within you. This is where identity begins to shift. You start noticing that old patterns no longer fit comfortably. Behaviors that once felt natural now feel distant. The way you tolerated inconsistency. The way you ignored your own needs. The way you over-explained your emotions to people who never tried to understand. All of it begins to feel foreign. Not because you are forcing change, but because awareness has already done the work. And awareness is irreversible. There is a stage in every transformation where you stop negotiating with your past self. You stop asking, "Why did I stay so long? Why did I ignore the signs? Why did I believe something that hurt me?" Instead, a different tone emerges internally. A quieter one. A more compassionate one. You begin to say, "I was doing the best I could with what I knew." This shift is subtle but profound, because judgment keeps you stuck in repetition, but understanding releases you from it. And when understanding replaces self-blame, something remarkable happens. Energy returns to you. Energy that was previously trapped in emotional loops begins to become available again. You start using that energy to rebuild your life. Not the life you had before the connection, but the life you now realize you actually want. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of transformation. You do not return to who you were. You become someone who can no longer fit inside that old identity. Think about it. After everything you have experienced, would you truly want to go back to being the version of yourself who accepted less than you deserved? Who ignored intuition? Who stayed silent to maintain peace? Who confused intensity with love? Probably not. Because awareness changes preference, and preference shapes direction. This is why transformation often feels like both loss and liberation at the same time. You are losing an old identity, but you are gaining a new consciousness. And consciousness changes everything. You begin to notice new boundaries forming naturally, not as rules you impose on yourself, but as instincts that arise from self-respect. You feel discomfort more quickly when something is misaligned. You recognize emotional inconsistency earlier. You walk away faster from situations that drain you. Not because you have become cold, but because you have become clear. Clarity is one of the most powerful outcomes of emotional transformation, because clarity removes confusion as a place to hide. And without confusion, truth becomes harder to avoid. There is also a quiet grief that can appear during this phase. A strange kind of mourning, not only for the person who changed your life, but for the version of yourself that existed before everything shifted. You may miss the simplicity of not knowing. You may miss the intensity of feeling deeply connected to something uncertain. You may miss the hope, even if it came with pain. Because hope, even when fragile, creates emotional aliveness. But transformation asks you to release not only what hurt you, but also what kept you emotionally dependent. This is not easy. It never is. Because the human mind prefers familiar suffering over unfamiliar peace. Familiar suffering feels predictable. Unfamiliar peace feels unknown. And the unknown often feels unsafe at first. But slowly something changes. Peace begins to feel less strange, less distant, more natural. You stop associating calm with emptiness. You stop equating silence with abandonment. You stop interpreting emotional neutrality as loss. And instead, you begin to recognize something else. Stability is not boring. Stability is safe. Another profound shift occurs in how you view relationships. You no longer measure connection by intensity alone. You begin to value consistency, emotional presence, clarity, mutual effort, respect that does not fluctuate based on mood or distance. You realize that true connection does not need to constantly prove itself through chaos. And this realization changes your standards permanently. In many spiritual traditions, this stage is described as integration. In psychology, it is often called individuation. Different languages, same truth. You are no longer seeking someone to complete your emotional world. You are building an emotional world that is already complete enough to share. This is a radical shift in perception, because now connection becomes a choice, not a necessity. And choices made from wholeness feel very different from choices made from lack. They are calmer, clearer, less desperate, more aligned. You also begin to notice something surprising. You are no longer afraid of being alone in the same way you once were. Not because you no longer desire connection, but because solitude no longer feels like absence. It feels like presence with yourself. And that changes everything. Because when you are no longer running from yourself, you finally have the space to meet yourself fully. This is where creativity often returns, where clarity about purpose begins to emerge, where long-forgotten dreams quietly resurface, not as pressure, but as possibility. And perhaps this is the most beautiful part of transformation. You begin to realize that the life you were waiting for was never meant to arrive through another person. It was always meant to emerge through you. The connection that once felt like everything becomes a doorway rather than a destination. And you finally understand. You were never meant to remain who you were before the storm. You were meant to become someone who could walk through it and still choose to grow, still choose to love, still choose yourself. So when you look back now, you no longer ask why it happened with the same pain you once carried. Instead, you ask with awareness, what did I become because I lived through this? And the answer quietly begins to form inside you. Someone stronger, someone clearer, someone more honest, someone no longer willing to abandon themselves for connection. And that version of you is not the one who was broken. It is the one who was built from everything you survived. And as this chapter closes, a new understanding emerges. The storm did not take you away from your life. It brought you back into it. And what comes next is no longer about returning to the past, but about finally stepping into the life you are now capable of living. There is a moment in every journey like this when silence becomes louder than the story itself. Not the silence after closure, but the silence after waiting, after hoping, after interpreting every sign, every coincidence, every emotional wave as proof that something meaningful was still unfolding somewhere beyond your control. At first, you call it patience. Then you call it timing. Then you call it faith. But eventually, if nothing seems to move, the mind begins to shift again. And a more painful interpretation begins to take shape. Maybe it wasn't meant to happen. Maybe I misunderstood everything. Maybe I was never chosen. Maybe I was simply imagining depth where there was none. This is often the place where emotional exhaustion quietly turns into self-doubt. Because when the outer world gives no answers, the inner world begins to question its own perception. And that is where suffering deepens, not from what happened, but from what the mind concludes about what happened. But what if the conclusion is wrong? What if the delay was never rejection? What if silence was never absence? What if nothing was wrong at all? In many spiritual traditions, there is a concept that life unfolds in layers of timing that human perception cannot fully grasp in the moment. Not because reality is mysterious in a mystical sense alone, but because human awareness is limited by immediacy. We interpret time linearly. We believe that if something is meant to happen, it should happen now, or soon, or according to emotional readiness. But life does not always move according to emotional readiness. It moves according to alignment. And alignment is not always visible while it is forming. Think of a seed buried underground. From the surface, nothing appears to be happening. No movement. No progress. No sign of life. If you judged only what you can see, you might assume nothing is happening at all. But beneath the soil, an invisible process is taking place. Roots are extending. Structures are forming. Strength is being built in complete darkness. The seed is not being ignored. It is being prepared. And preparation is not a visible process. It is an internal one. This is one of the most difficult truths to accept during emotional longing. Not everything meaningful looks like progress while it is happening. Some things only make sense when they emerge fully formed. This applies not only to personal growth, but also to relationships that feel deeply significant yet remain uncertain in their expression. There are experiences that arrive quickly, and there are experiences that require unfolding. And unfolding cannot be rushed without distorting its natural shape. This is why many people reach a breaking point emotionally, not because love is absent, but because expectation has outrun reality. Expectation says, if this is real, it should already be here. But reality often responds in a quieter language. If this is real, it is still becoming. And becoming is not instant. In the spiritual interpretation of deeply meaningful connections, what some people refer to as twin flame experiences, this stage is often described as divine timing. But even if one removes spiritual terminology entirely, the psychological truth remains remarkably similar. Certain emotional bonds activate internal change that must stabilize before external alignment becomes possible. When a person enters your life and deeply affects your emotional system, they do not only affect your feelings toward them. They often affect your identity, your patterns, your beliefs about relationships, your sense of worth, your attachment responses. An identity change is not immediate. It unfolds over time. Sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, sometimes through distance rather than closeness. This is where misunderstanding often begins, because the mind assumes that emotional intensity should produce immediate clarity. But emotional intensity often produces the opposite first: confusion, uncertainty, overthinking, emotional amplification. This does not mean the connection is false. It means the system is recalibrating, like a compass spinning when it is placed near a strong magnetic field. It does not immediately point north. It first loses orientation before it regains it. Many people interpret this disorientation as a sign to stop believing. But sometimes, it is simply a sign that recalibration is still in progress. One of the most important reframe points in any transformation journey is this: delay is not absence of meaning. Delay is often the space where meaning stabilizes. Without delay, meaning would be shallow. Without distance, awareness would be incomplete. Without uncertainty, growth would be minimal. Consider how emotional maturity actually develops. Not through constant reassurance, but through moments of absence where you learn to regulate yourself. Not through constant connection, but through separation where you learn to define your own emotional center. Not through immediate answers, but through questions that remain long enough for insight to form. This is why many of the most significant emotional experiences in life are not defined by what happened at the peak, but by what changed during the waiting, during the silence, during the distance. At first, waiting feels passive, but in reality, waiting is often where internal restructuring happens. It is where dependency transforms into awareness. where attachment transforms into observation, where longing transforms into understanding. There is a psychological principle that explains this transformation. Neural patterns strengthen through repetition, but they also weaken through interruption. When an emotional pattern is continuously reinforced, it becomes automatic. But when it is interrupted, the mind begins to reevaluate its structure. This is why distance can feel painful yet transformative at the same time. It interrupts the emotional loop. An interruption creates space for reflection. Reflection creates awareness. Awareness creates change. And change creates a new identity. So what feels like loss may actually be restructuring. What feels like rejection may actually be redirection. What feels like delay may actually be alignment forming out of view. There is also another layer to this experience that is often overlooked. Sometimes, what we interpret as waiting for another person is actually waiting for ourselves. Waiting for emotional readiness. Waiting for inner stability. Waiting for self-worth to fully mature. Waiting for clarity about what we will and will not accept. Because without this internal development, even the return of what we desire would not feel stable. We would still filter it through fear, through insecurity, through old patterns, and that would recreate the same emotional instability in a different form. This is why timing in relationships is rarely about one person being ready. It is about both people becoming capable of holding what they once only felt intensely. Intensity is not the same as capacity. Feeling is not the same as readiness. Desire is not the same as alignment. And life often protects people not by denying them what they want, but by delaying it until they are capable of receiving it without losing themselves. This is a difficult truth to accept emotionally, because the human heart prefers immediate resolution. But emotional maturity requires something deeper. Trust in unseen development. Trust that what is meant to align will not be lost through timing alone. Trust that absence is not erasure. Trust that silence is not negation. And trust that growth continues even when nothing visible appears to change. At some point in this journey, a shift occurs. You stop asking, "When will it happen?" And you begin asking, "What is this teaching me about who I am becoming?" This shift is subtle, but it is profound, because it moves your attention from external control to internal evolution. And internal evolution is the only aspect of life you have always been shaping, even when it felt like nothing was happening. Eventually, you begin to see the entire experience differently. The waiting was not empty. The silence was not void. The delay was not punishment. It was preparation layered inside awareness you could not yet access at the time. And perhaps the greatest realization of all is this: what was truly meant for you was never lost in the waiting. Because anything that requires you to abandon yourself in order to receive it was never aligned to begin with. And anything that aligns with who you are becoming will meet you when you are ready to hold it without losing yourself in the process. So instead of interpreting delay as rejection, you begin to recognize it as refinement. Not everything is being withheld. Some things are being prepared, including you. And when both are ready, life no longer feels like waiting. It feels like arriving. There comes a point in every transformation where the past stops calling your name the way it used to. Not because the memories disappear, not because the emotions vanish, but because something deeper inside you has changed its position. What once felt like home no longer feels like a place you can return to. What once felt familiar now feels distant. Even the version of you that once made certain choices no longer feels fully reachable. And yet, strangely, this does not feel like loss in the same way it once did. It feels like distance that cannot be crossed backwards, only forward. This is the final stage of transformation. Not the moment of awakening. Not the moment of confusion. Not even the moment of release. But the moment you realize you are no longer the person who began this journey, and you cannot return to them. At first, this realization can feel unsettling, because the human mind is built to seek continuity. We want to believe that we are the same person across time, that life is a straight line, that no matter what happens, we remain fundamentally unchanged beneath it all. But emotional transformation does not work that way. It reshapes identity quietly, gradually, then suddenly. And one day you look back and realize, the person who experienced that relationship, that pain, that longing no longer exists in the same form. They have been rewritten by experience. Not erased, but rewritten. This is where many people experience a strange emotional tension. On one hand, they feel stronger than before, more aware, more grounded, more selective with their energy. On the other hand, there is a subtle grief for the version of themselves who could still believe certain illusions. The version who still trusted easily. The version who still saw life through simpler emotional patterns. The version who had not yet been shaped by disappointment or depth. But growth always carries this dual nature. It gives clarity, but it takes innocence. It gives strength, but it removes simplicity. It gives awareness, but it removes blindness. And yet, no one who truly transforms would willingly go back. Because even if the old version of you felt lighter, they were also more vulnerable to repeating the same emotional cycles. Now something has changed. You no longer confuse intensity with truth. You no longer confuse attention with love. You no longer confuse uncertainty with destiny. You begin to see patterns instead of isolated moments. And this shift in perception changes everything. Because once you see patterns, you cannot unsee them. There is a psychological truth behind this. The brain does not return easily to previous interpretations once a new framework has been formed. New awareness reorganizes perception, and perception shapes emotional reality. This is why transformation feels irreversible. Not because life outside has dramatically changed, but because the way you interpret life has permanently shifted. At this stage, many people also experience something unexpected. A quiet detachment from their former emotional urgency. Things that once triggered deep emotional reactions now feel more neutral. Situations that once caused anxiety now feel manageable. Memories that once felt overwhelming now feel integrated. This is not emotional numbness. It is emotional reorganization. Your system is no longer reacting from survival mode. It is responding from awareness. And awareness does not rush. It observes. It understands. It chooses. Within the symbolic language often used in twin flame discussions, this stage is sometimes described as integration or embodiment. But even without spiritual framing, the experience is universal. It is the moment when lessons are no longer external events, but internal truths you now live by. You no longer need reminders of what you have learned, because you have become the lesson. And that is when something profound happens. The connection that once felt central to your identity begins to lose its emotional dominance. Not because it becomes meaningless, but because it becomes contextual. It is no longer the center of your emotional world. It becomes part of your history, and history no longer controls your direction. It informs it. This is where true freedom begins to appear. Because freedom is not the absence of memory. It is the absence of emotional dependency on memory. You can remember without reopening wounds. You can reflect without falling backward. You can acknowledge without attaching. And that is a level of emotional maturity many people spend years trying to reach. At this stage, something subtle but powerful shifts in how you relate to love. You no longer seek experiences that consume you. You begin to seek experiences that support your expansion. You are no longer drawn to emotional chaos as proof of depth. You begin to recognize that depth can also exist in calmness, consistency, and mutual respect. This is a radical redefinition of love for many people. Because earlier stages of emotional awakening often associate intensity with meaning. But later stages recognize something deeper. Meaning does not require emotional instability. Love does not require confusion. Connection does not require suffering. And growth does not require losing yourself. There is also a deeper integration happening beneath conscious awareness. Your nervous system begins to recalibrate. What once felt like emotional highs and lows begins to stabilize. You become less reactive and more responsive. Less impulsive and more intentional. Less driven by fear and more guided by clarity. This is what emotional wholeness begins to feel like. Not perfection, but coherence. Different parts of you begin working together instead of against each other. Your heart no longer pulls you in one direction, while your mind pulls you in another. Instead, there is alignment. And alignment feels calm. Not because life becomes predictable, but because you trust yourself more within uncertainty. One of the most significant realizations in this chapter is this. You were never meant to return to the person you were before everything happened. Because that person was shaped by limitation, by lack of awareness, by unprocessed emotional patterns, by survival strategies that were necessary at the time, but no longer serve your present reality. Returning to that version of yourself would mean abandoning everything you have learned. And something inside you now resists that idea completely. Even if nostalgia appears, even if longing appears, even if old emotional echoes try to pull you backward, there is a quiet inner knowing that says, I cannot go back there. Not because the past was meaningless, but because you are no longer compatible with it. This is where acceptance begins to replace resistance. You stop negotiating with what has already changed. You stop reopening emotional doors that were meant to close. You stop trying to recreate emotional states that belonged to an earlier version of you. Instead, you begin to live from where you are now. And where you are now is different. Not just emotionally, but existentially. You begin to notice that your decisions are no longer driven by fear of loss, but by alignment with truth. You no longer stay in situations simply because they feel familiar. You no longer pursue connections simply because they feel intense. You no longer ignore your inner voice for the sake of external attachment. This is not detachment from life. It is deeper engagement with it. Because now, your choices come from clarity rather than confusion. And clarity is one of the most powerful forms of inner stability a human being can develop. At this stage, even the idea of waiting for someone begins to dissolve. Not because love no longer matters, but because your sense of wholeness is no longer dependent on external completion. You begin to understand that anything truly aligned with your life will not require you to abandon yourself in order to receive it. And anything that requires self-abandonment is not alignment. It is repetition of old patterns in a new form. This realization is quiet, but irreversible. Because once you truly understand your own value through lived experience, you cannot unknow it. And so the final truth of this journey is not about reunion, not about loss, not about destiny, but about identity. You were never meant to remain the same person who entered the storm. You were meant to be reshaped by it. And now that you have been, the question is no longer, will I go back to what I lost? The question becomes, what kind of life is now possible because I survived what I thought would break me? And in that question, something opens. Not backward, but forward. Because the life ahead of you is not waiting for the old version of you to return. It is waiting for the version of you who finally understands. You were never meant to go back. You were always meant to become. There is a quiet moment at the end of every long emotional journey when everything finally becomes still enough for truth to be heard. Not the truth you searched for in signs. Not the truth you tried to decode in silence, timing, or distance. But a simpler truth. A deeper one. One that does not arrive with intensity, but with clarity. And in that moment, something inside you finally stops chasing meaning outside yourself. Because you begin to realize, you were never actually lost. You were becoming. For so long, the journey felt like it was about someone else. Their presence. Their absence. Their words. Their silence. Their return. Their meaning in your life. You believed the story was pointing toward them. That they were the center of something destined. That everything unfolding in your emotional world was leading toward a reunion, an answer, a completion. But now something feels different. The emotional noise has softened. The urgency has dissolved. And what remains is not longing, but awareness. And awareness reveals something unexpected. They were not the destination. They were the doorway. And you were the destination all along. At first, this realization does not land easily, because the mind resists it. The mind prefers external anchors. It prefers a who to explain the why. It prefers a storyline that places meaning in another person, because that feels simpler than the deeper truth. Nothing outside you is ever responsible for completing you. They may have awakened something. They may have triggered something. They may have reflected something. But they were never the source of it. They were the mirror, not the origin. And once you begin to see this clearly, the entire emotional structure of the experience shifts. What once felt like fate tied to another person begins to reveal itself as an internal unfolding. What once felt like loss begins to reveal itself as expansion. What once felt like waiting begins to reveal itself as becoming. This is where the final integration begins. And integration does not arrive with drama. It arrives with simplicity. You wake up one day and realize you are no longer checking, no longer analyzing, no longer revisiting old conversations in your mind, no longer searching for hidden meanings in silence. Not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped fragmenting yourself around uncertainty. Something inside you has settled, not into answers, but into self-trust. And self-trust changes everything. Because when you trust yourself, you no longer need constant external validation to feel grounded. You no longer need certainty from others to feel stable within yourself. You no longer need emotional closure to continue living fully. You begin to understand that closure is not something someone gives you. Closure is something you create when you decide to stop reopening what has already taught you its lesson. There is a profound shift that happens here. The emotional center of gravity moves. It is no longer located outside of you. It returns to you. And this return is subtle. It does not feel like a dramatic victory. It feels like coming home to yourself in a way you did not know you had been away. You begin to notice small changes. You laugh more easily again. You sleep more peacefully. You make decisions without overthinking every possibility. You feel less emotionally pulled by what once consumed your attention. And perhaps most importantly, you feel more like yourself than you have in a long time. Not the version of yourself shaped by longing. Not the version shaped by confusion. Not the version shaped by emotional dependency. But the version that existed before all of that was activated and evolved beyond it. This is what true transformation looks like. Not becoming someone new, but returning to who you are without fear. And yet, even that phrase is incomplete, because you are not simply returning. You are integrating everything you have learned along the way. So you are not the same person you were before, but you are no longer fragmented by what happened either. You are whole in a new way, a way that includes your past without being defined by it, a way that includes your pain without being controlled by it, a way that includes your memories without being trapped inside them. At this stage, something remarkable becomes clear. The connection that once felt like the center of your universe was never meant to be the center at all. It was meant to redirect you toward your own inner world, toward your own emotional truth, toward your own capacity for self-awareness, toward your own ability to choose yourself. And in choosing yourself repeatedly, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, you begin to discover something that cannot be taught, only experienced. You were never incomplete. You were never waiting to be fixed. You were never missing a piece that existed in another person. You were simply unaware of your own depth. And the journey revealed it. There is also a quiet acceptance that emerges at this stage. Acceptance not of what you lost, but of what you no longer need to hold on to. You stop trying to rewrite the past. You stop negotiating with what has already unfolded. You stop searching for alternate versions of events where things turned out differently, because you begin to see that every version of the journey led you here. To awareness, to clarity, to self-recognition. And in that recognition, something powerful dissolves. The illusion that your life was ever dependent on a single outcome. You begin to see that life was never narrowing your path toward one person. It was expanding you into a version of yourself capable of experiencing love without losing yourself inside it. Capable of connection without dependency. Capable of depth without distortion. Capable of longing without abandonment of self. And this is perhaps the most important transformation of all. You stop abandoning yourself for the idea of love. You start embodying love as something that includes you. Not something that replaces you. Not something that completes you. But something that flows through you because you are no longer resisting your own wholeness. And in this state, something extraordinary happens. The emotional weight you once carried begins to transform into wisdom. The confusion becomes insight. The longing becomes gratitude. The pain becomes understanding. Not because it was meant to hurt you, but because it was meant to shape you. There is no final chapter where everything resolves into perfection. There is only a final understanding. You do not arrive at love by finding the right person. You arrive at love by no longer abandoning yourself in its pursuit. And once you reach that place, the entire meaning of your journey becomes clear. They did not complete your story. They revealed that you were the one writing it all along. And now, standing at the end of what once felt like an emotional labyrinth, you finally see what was hidden in plain sight from the beginning. The love you were searching for outside yourself was never missing. It was simply waiting for you to recognize it within. And when you do, everything changes. Not because the world becomes different, but because you do. And that is the only ending this journey was ever leading you toward. Not reunion, not return, but remembrance. You were the destination all along.